It's Saleemul Huq, who works for the International Institute for Environment and Development, and who is also now involved in establishing, well, it is established, a new international academic institution in Bangladesh on adaptation. In fact, Saleem is known around these parts as Mr. Adaptation. Well, perhaps I could begin by asking, since Ivo de Boer finished on this incredible note after the video, following on his promise of action, do you think that he can deliver, leaving aside for the moment the fact that he's a UN official and perhaps shouldn't make promises like that?
Well, I think I share Ivo's optimism, and obviously he isn't the one who's going to deliver. It's going to be the leaders who come here who are going to deliver. But the two reasons for my optimism are, firstly, this is the very first time that the climate change issue is being addressed at the very highest level by heads of government. Previous conferences of parties like these, the last 14 before this one, have all been headed by ministers of environment. The climate change problem is simply too big for ministers of environment to solve. It needs ministers of finance to unleash hundreds of billions of dollars, and it needs heads of state to make the requisite changes in the economies that are going to be needed. So the fact that heads of state like President Obama from the US, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh from India, Prime Minister Wen Jiabao from China are going to be here, along with another 100+ heads of state, is a good sign. It may well not succeed, but at least they will be the decision makers and will not have to refer back to their capitals to make a decision. And hopefully while they're here, we will have a decision.
Are you sure you're not being sort of professionally optimistic? Because I've heard you say everything's up in the air, anything can happen.
Well, I am a professional optimist, so I'm not going to give up till the very last minute. And there are reasons for pessimism, which I acknowledge. But let me be realistic. Two things are likely to happen. Firstly, the negotiating text that they've been working on, the negotiators have been working on for the last 2 years since Bali, is not in shape to finish off here. We've got 4 more days to finish it. Starting today, there has to be done by Thursday. It's not going to be done. We know that. So the question then is, when the high level starts with the ministers on Friday and with the heads of state next week, how much agreed information or agreed issues will they have to make it into what is now being called a political agreement? And the question now is, what can be agreed here in Copenhagen and what then can be left to after Copenhagen to be sorted out in the next 6 to 12 months? I am optimistic that the heads of state, when they do come here together, will see the magnitude of the problem and the need for all countries to step up to solve it. And that is happening already. In the last few days, we've had the United States put forward targets, which they'd never done before. We've had China and India put forward intensity targets, which they'd never done before. In the last 24 hours, we've had South Africa put together a reduction target over the next 20 years, which they've not done before. So all countries are realizing that they need to do something, and they're prepared to do something. The question now is how much. When you add up what the offers are on the table, then it doesn't come near enough to solving the problem. And the optimistic scenario is that they can do the math. They'll come here, they'll see that it's not adding up, and they'll say everybody needs to up their ante. So we have to go for broke, but as long as everybody else does. And that's really the catch. So far it's been, this is what we are prepared to do, and not thinking about the global collective, if you like, outcomes. Now is that opportunity, is to think globally and come up with a global solution.
So, as they say around here, nothing's agreed till everything's agreed. But what can you identify, in a media soundbite way, what are the main blockages here?
There are 2 main blockages which haven't been resolved in the negotiations. The first one is with regard to excuse me, the emission reductions, mitigation in climate change parlance, primarily for the Annex 1 countries, those that were in Kyoto, and the United States, which was not in Kyoto, taking on economy-wide targets at a very significant level. The IPCC calls for 25 to 40% reductions by 2020 compared to a 1990 baseline. None of them are near that. And then significant actions, not necessarily a reduction target, from the major developing countries like China, India, Brazil, and South Africa and Indonesia. As I said, the Annex 1 countries have put forward targets, inadequate as they are, non-Annex 1 countries have put forward actions that they're prepared to take domestically, which hopefully they'll be willing to increase if they're given further technology and money, which leads to the second intractable issue, which is money. Money is the glue that holds everything else together. No money, no glue, nothing gets held together. It all falls apart. The amount of money being offered at the moment isn't very much. People are talking about, Prime Minister Gordon Brown has talked about $10 billion starting immediately in 2013, going up to $100 billion in 2020. Developing countries are demanding in the order of hundreds of billions from 2020 onwards and much greater amounts immediately. This is a sums game. The developed country heads of state coming here are going to have to put a bit more effort into squeezing some money out in order to sweeten the deal, because without putting more money on the table, nothing else will get done.
Well, that's very interesting, but can I ask you one question then? Because since your billed as Mr. Adaptation, do you think there's a danger that with all this excitement and emphasis on the cuts that have to be made, and now there's an emphasis on developing countries making some stronger commitment than before, even without specifying numbers, that adaptation is in danger of being a little overlooked? It's just not perhaps such a sexy subject here as some of the others, money and cuts.
Well, I wouldn't put it that way. What I would say is that adaptation in the Bali Action Plan at the 13th Conference of Parties was put front and center as one of the building blocks, unlike previous agreements like the Kyoto Protocol, which had no adaptation at all. It was all mitigation. So when they had the Bali Action Plan agreed in 2 years ago in Bali at the 13th Conference of Parties, mitigation and adaptation were put as the two central equal building blocks of the new Copenhagen Agreement. What has happened in the meantime is that there's a growing consensus on adaptation. Nobody says adaptation shouldn't take place. Everybody's for adaptation, which is a good thing. The question is, how much money is there going to be for adaptation? And so far, the amounts of money being offered are deemed to be inadequate. So it's a question of how much funding will come. But adaptation is not a contentious issue, which is why I didn't raise it as one of the things that will make or break. It's just about how much money will be available for it.
So, like any boring reviewer confronted with a guest who knows 10 times more than he does, I tried to find a definition of adaptation. Just to be clear, roughly speaking, adaptation is the term used to refer to preparations to protect people, businesses and infrastructure from the worst impacts of climate change. Is that okay?
That's correct. I mean, basically what we've seen is an evolution of the concept of what the problem was and what therefore the solution to the problem was. We started off the problem being emissions of greenhouse gases, which in future will lead to some dangerous level of climate change, which we can prevent. The prevention being reducing those emissions. And so the UN Framework Convention originally, and then the Kyoto Protocol a few years later, focused on mitigation, how to reduce emissions so that we prevent or avoid the worst impacts. Over time, and particularly after the third assessment report of the IPCC became available, we have become aware that we have failed to prevent some level of impacts of climate change, at least in the near term, for the next 10 to 20 years. And those impacts will be primarily on poor countries, poor people, even in rich countries. So the issue of adaptation to the inevitable and unavoidable impacts of climate change became part of the mix in terms of strategies for dealing with the problem. So now, as I said, with the Bali Action Plan, it's very firmly recognized that the twin tracks for dealing with the problem are mitigation and adaptation, neither less or more important than the other, both equally important.
Okay, now Mike, before I go over to my colleague Jeffrey Allen, who's monitoring the blogosphere and the Twitter sphere and everything else spheres, I just want to pick up for clarification on one term you've used, which seems to be very evident at this conference and wasn't, to my knowledge, at Bali and Poznan, which is carbon intensity. Can you just explain what that is?
Sure. Carbon intensity is to link the emissions that are produced by a country or a sector within a country associated with the economic production. So it's the, if you like, the tons of carbon produced per percentage GDP increased. And the argument that countries like India and China make is that they're still developing. They need economic growth. And some of that will necessarily be associated with higher levels of emissions. But what they want to do, and they're prepared to do, and they're offering to do, is to de-link economic growth and GDP growth from carbon, and the jargon is reduce carbon intensity. So for every percentage of GDP growth, instead of having whatever tonnage of carbon emissions they had before, they will bring those tons down by using cleaner energy and cleaner sources. But in the near term, they will have to be allowed to increase for a while before they start going down.